Hey everybody, this week's video is in quite a different setup this time around. I am in my college dorm at the moment. The building is really hot, the AC is out, so if I look a little sweaty or, if I'm like a little out of breath, that's why. I'm still working on putting things up throughout. I've only moved in like a day or so ago, and I've just been running around doing classes. But today's video is going to be about The Walking Dead Season 2 cut content. And this is one that I would say is very juicy. There is a lot of cut content from this game, especially in terms of the ending and some of the character bits along the way. I'm sure you'll find it all very interesting. And before we get started, I just want to say this game is my favorite of the Walking Dead Telltale games. I love it. I know that's sort of like a dark horse pick. A lot of people prefer either Season 1 or Season 4, but I just love this game so much for all of its flaws, with how bleak it is, how dark it is. I love it. And I'm so excited to finally be covering this. I spent a summer with my friend who she watches these videos, and you might see her fighting in the comments for her life because she likes to say controversial things on the internet. We played through all of the Telltale Walking Dead games over one summer, and I went in with Season 2 as my favorite, and I came out with Season 2 as my favorite because frankly, I love it. And I'm just happy I get to cover it and talk about it. So yeah. So without further ado, let's get into the cut content of The Walking Dead Season 2. So starting in Episode 1, there's an unused model of a dead rabbit. And this is a lot more interesting than I think most people would give it credit for. It's because it's related to a very, very different version of Clem's encounter with the dog Sam. Originally, Clem was going to be walking along, and she would find the dog, Sam, eating a maggot-infested rabbit. And this would make her bite that she ends up getting from him all the more concerning. There's a cut fishing sequence from the game, and we know this because of some file names, as well as the fact that there are some sort of, I guess, inventory icons or icons from a QTE relating to fishing in the files. Originally, the character Krista was going to be present throughout the entire game. Apparently, she was cut from the script fairly midway through development and would have played a much bigger role. Now, this begs the question of how they would reunite after they get separated by the bandits. With her being in Season 1, she knows who Kenny is, so her dynamic with him would be much more interesting, especially in sequences where he, refers to Duck, or his family, or people talk about him, when nobody's around. She could offer a lot of insight to that. So it's very interesting to think about how she would have been used in the story originally. Like I said earlier, the sequence where Clementine gets bit by Sam the dog was originally a lot different. Another interesting thing is there's an unused animation involving Clementine and her hat. Apparently originally, Clementine was supposed to fall, lose her hat, and Sam would pick it up. She would try to get it back from him at some point, and that would lead to him biting her. There is some unused dialogue from the opening sequence where Omid is killed. One of the more interesting pieces is him announcing that he's entering the bathroom. He says it, and he continues to talk before he is then cut off, presumably by being shot.
Clementine, everything okay?
This is sort of interesting because in the final game, he's completely silent. He enters and then is immediately shot. So this sort of dynamic would have been a lot more interesting, I guess, or even more dark, considering that this person is now fully choosing to shoot him as he's entering instead of it being like an instinctual reaction. There's also some unused dialogue around Clementine and Sam, with specifically talking about Sam taking her hat.
I wonder where he got my hat. Mind if I take my hat back? Please don't hurt me, okay? I just want my hat back, and then I'll go.
This just lends more evidence to this original idea where her hat would get taken and that's how she would end up being bitten. I think it's very in character for her to go after the hat, especially at this point in her life. She's so young that it's still one of the only things that she has to hold on to from her parents, as well as, her time with Lee. So it makes total sense for her to put herself in danger for this hat. Something interesting is that the flashback with pregnant Krista and Omid was originally going to appear in episode 2 as sort of a flashback in the middle of things. An interesting fact about Michelle, who is the bandit who ends up killing Omid, is that she originally wasn't meant to appear in the episode, at least in the same way that she does now. So a lot of her model and textures are stitched together from pre-existing characters, sort of last minute, I guess. For example, her hair texture is the same as Victor, who's another scavenger, and the texture itself is nearly identical, it's just the model that they're spreading it over looks a bit different. And Michelle's body is actually a recolor of one of Krista's outfits. Omid wasn't meant to appear in this first episode. Like I said, that flashback was originally supposed to appear in episode 2. So his texture in this one, he actually uses the body model of Carlos from later in the game. Krista's pregnant model, I guess you could say, is listed as Krista 202, which once again cements that originally this flashback was going to happen in episode 2. Clementine's outfit in the flashback of episode 1 is just a retexture and a recolor of an outfit from season 1. And really the only difference is it's a good way to show off the difference in tone between the seasons. Season 2's is a lot darker, it's a lot grimier, because overall this game is much more depressing. Now we're going to go into episode 2. There was originally going to be a flashback of Lee at the beginning of episode 2. Now this isn't the same one that happens later, this is a completely different one. It would start with Clementine in a field in a red car, and she would see Lee walking towards her, until eventually seeing Omid and sort of snapping out of it. Episode 2 is very, very light on the details when it comes to cut content. There really isn't that much that I found, whether it's on the cutting room floor or even subreddits and theory posts that I found. Not much has been really mentioned around season 2. I feel like the only things that could have changed would have been a butterfly effect of some of the cut content from episode 1. So for example, the bite that Clem sustains from Sam. If he had been eating the maggots in the original sequence, maybe there would have been much more of an infection, and that could have raised suspicions of the group when they find Clementine and see that she's been bitten. Other things like possibly her hat being a different texture because it would have been chewed on by Sam, as well as other minor details, especially considering that Krista was meant to return in the story. So really it's more of just the butterfly effect of what would have been different. But beyond that, there's not much that's concrete in episode 2. So now we're going to go into episode 3. Now we're going to start this one with a much darker cut storyline that some say was fake, others swear by it being in the game originally or at some point in development. I'm not here to say which is true, I'm just here to talk about it. It appears that in some point of the story, Troy was meant to abuse Clementine. And this is disturbing for many, many reasons. Clementine is about 12 in this game, and with the amount of dark themes and dark events that happen into this game, with the amount of dark themes and dark events that go on in this game, and I'm not talking just dark as in, oh, people die because of zombies. There are things that are very, very depressing throughout this entire game. That's one of the main complaints that I've heard about it, is that it's so bleak that it isn't fun to play because it's just suffering the whole way and this poor kid is having to go through it. So when it comes to something as serious as this, it's hard to imagine this actually coming to fruition in a video game. Having the protagonist go through something, not even just the protagonist, a child protagonist, go through something so traumatic, so intense, I can't think of a tasteful or any way that it could be done without just alienating and turning away so many people playing the game. I feel like many people would just put down the controller right there and say, I can't do this. Now, this is most likely speculation. I've seen it in a few different Reddit posts, in compilations of what cut content would have included. However, there are no files, no models, and thank God no animations that prove that this was programmed into the game in the, close enough to release that we have hard evidence of it. It's certainly possible because of how dark this game gets. However, who knows? This really just seems like the Troy segment of the video. So originally, Troy was going to be in place of Carver. And what I mean by this is that Troy's character model was used for Carver. He was named Carver, and he did all the things that Carver did. He even had Carver's a voice actor originally voicing him. This would have made him a very, very complicated character. And I don't mean that in the sense of, oh, he's dynamic, I don't know how to feel about him. I mean in that he would have a lot going on. With how much he's featured throughout the story in his current retail version, as well as how he has a relationship or had a relationship with Jane. We don't know exactly the details of that. For him to be in that position would have had him doing a lot. He would have been in a lot of different places at once. Apparently the reason why he was changed or made into Troy is because Carver's voice actor they felt didn't fit the look of the character. So instead of scrapping all the model work they had done, they decided to create Troy. Another interesting idea that was eventually cut, and this was cut much earlier in development, was that Kenny was going to be the main antagonist of the game. And that Kenny would have been in sort of Carver's position throughout the story, which I personally really love. Even though much of the story would probably be different in terms of how Kenny and Clementine reunite, I feel like you still would have encountered him in the cabin, but his backstory would be much, much different. You would still end up in his compound, but maybe Clementine would get some sort of special treatment from him because he knows her, he trusts her. And that would have given the player a very, very interesting moral dilemma between this old friend that we know and we love, but he's become sort of this power-hungry maniac, versus these people we just met who didn't treat us well, they locked us in a shed, but they need help right now, and they are being used by our old friend. This is something that I don't know if it would have really played into the final ending in the same way that it's, Kenny versus Jane now, if it still would have been a choice between Kenny and someone else. But either way, to have Kenny as more of a clear-cut antagonist in this game would have, once again, added to this much, much darker tone, and I think would have been a very interesting idea to present, especially for a very young character like Clementine, trying to figure out who she is in this world. Some interesting things that may have made it through the cracks from this original draft with Kenny as the villain is how Carver is sort of not necessarily parental to Clementine. He encourages her to fend for herself and be selfish because it's the best way to survive. And I could absolutely see Kenny being in a similar position of power, telling Clementine, this is how you get by, this is how you live. And it would have had a lot of weight if it was Kenny saying that, not just Carver, who I think we can agree we all hate. Now we are on to episode 4. Here are some unused animations that are found in the files of episode 4. Apparently, Vince was originally going to help shoot walkers from the roof at some point. There's an animation of him doing that. There's an animation of Tivia, I believe I'm saying her name correctly, being grabbed by a walker and basically pushed off the roof of House and breaking her neck and dying. The animation of the walker approaching her is still present. However, the animation of her falling off and dying is nowhere to be found. Jane is a character that myself and others struggle to like. She's someone who can be problematic at times, and while she might be the voice of reason, she doesn't voice that in a way that makes you want to stand behind her, I feel like. But originally, she was a little more endearing. Jane and Clementine were going to go to the trailer park to try and find the rest of the group. There's some subtitles that basically say how she would have originally told a joke. These moments are what we're missing with Jane. Moments that make her feel like a whole character, not someone who's just there to oppose Kenny. And I feel like the final choice between her and Kenny would have felt a lot more satisfying if she had more of these moments with Clementine. This is one that was cut for seemingly being too goofy. Originally, at some point in this episode, while the group is traveling together, they would have encountered a tiger that had escaped from a zoo. Now, there's a few different ways this could have played out. It could have played out all the way at the end of the story, where Clementine wanders into a city and there's a tiger there. but that one doesn't really have much weight to it. The one that I find the most interesting and the most probable is that members of the group or people would be attacked in the night, taken off by some unknown creature, and the group would assume that it was some sort of, cannibals, bandits, or even a quote-unquote super walker. However, in the end, it would be revealed that this tiger that escaped from a zoo had been stalking the group the whole time and was sort of like a man-eater type. However, this was ultimately cut, and this is before the comics introduced a tiger, so at the time they really thought it was kind of ridiculous. Why would you have a tiger in The Walking Dead? But here we are. This is sort of cut content, sort of not. When the group is ambushed by Arvo and the Russians, there's a few Russians who only speak in Russian, and the subtitles are just labeled as Russian. However, in the files, there's subtitles that show what he was actually saying. Basically, it's a lot of him giving orders and asking what Kenny and Clementine's group is saying. Minus Arvo, it appears that all the Russians were made very late into development. They all are consisted of reused pieces of other characters from earlier in the season. Now we are on to episode 5. Originally, and when I say originally, I mean until a few hours after release when it was patched out, there was a choice for Clementine to shoot Mike, which would kill him. And this animation can be found within the files and was originally a choice.
Now I'm gonna walk up to you nice and slow, and you're gonna give me the gun, okay?
Why are you doing this?
He didn't give us any choice.
Он злой человек.
Just give me the gun, Clem. I'm not gonna hurt you. Easy.
Stay back! I'll shoot.
There we go.
Which, for some reason, I almost remember. I don't know, because I don't think I played it immediately when it released, but I remember there being some kind of choice and consequence of choosing to shoot Mike. However, for whatever reason, this was cut literally a few hours after release when it was patched. Now we're getting into the really juicy stuff. The choice between Kenny and Jane was not between Kenny and Jane. It was between Kenny and Luke. Luke, the character who's pretty much an older brother to Clementine at this point. He's had her back pretty much since the beginning. And if you're like me, you really grew to love Luke as a character. He cares, he tries, and he has Clementine's back in a way that nobody has since season 1. He truly cares for others, and he is a great addition to the characters in this game. So for the original choice to come down to Luke or Kenny, it would have had a much, much deeper emotional impact, I feel. Because Jane sort of shows up at the end, and I don't know about you guys, but despite the fact that in a lot of situations she was correct, she always felt like just an antagonist. She never felt like she had a purpose other than to be Kenny's foil, which Luke does in a reasonable and realistic way all the way back in episode 2, 3, and 4. Him and Kenny have organic disagreements and clearly butt heads on a lot of things, especially when it comes down to their relationship with Clementine. I mean, when you first meet Kenny again, you have the choice between sitting with Luke and his group or sitting with Kenny. Overall, I feel like this was just a much more compelling way to go with the story, especially because of the bond you build with Luke throughout the game. So, in the original version of the Kenny versus Jane fight, you were going to be prompted to shoot Jane, not Kenny. And the outcome would have been the opposite, pretty much. But this was changed because so few people chose to shoot Kenny that they thought it would be a much more grueling choice to let this character you love brutally take out Jane. And that this would, make people question their choices a lot more, that sort of thing. That's why it was ultimately changed. There's some animation that is very, very buggy left in the files. I don't know if I'll be able to show it, but it sort of proves that this was originally prompted. And finally, the, I guess, second darkest piece of content that was ultimately cut was the Better to Sleep ending. And the reason it's called this is because Better to Sleep was the original name of episode 5. In this, the fight between Kenny and Jane, or Kenny and Luke, we're not sure which was the preferred one at this point in time, would have left Clementine completely alone. Both of them would have been fatally wounded by the end of it, no matter your choice, I guess. This would have left Clementine to take AJ and walk through a blizzard to what appeared to be a town off in the distance. Through either visuals or maybe in some sort of QTE button mashing, something like that, it would have become clear to the player that AJ is getting harder and harder to hold on to. He's getting heavier and heavier, and the winter is getting stronger and stronger, and this blizzard is slowing Clementine down, and she's fighting and fighting, and it would prompt the player to leave AJ behind. If the player chooses to leave AJ behind, she simply leaves him on a bench in the snow and walks to the town. If the player were to choose not to put down AJ, Clementine and him would have sat down together just to rest and fallen asleep and died due to the hypothermia. This ending is incredibly dark for obvious reasons, and was cut for what I feel are obvious reasons. In terms of story, this really would have put the writers in a corner of where they could go with the Walking Dead Telltale games. It's really hard to continue a series when, presumably, half of the player base's playthrough ended with the main character's death. On the other hand, if they did continue the story with the ending where Clementine survives, that means that the third game would have had to grapple with the fact that in order to survive, Clementine, at 12 years old, left an infant out to die in a blizzard. It is incredibly morbid, and it's something that fits in line with some of the other pieces of cut content, such as Troy and Clementine. People often joke about there being a darker cut of The Walking Dead Season 2, and I'm sure there is. The fact that we know about this ending and the possible thing with Troy shows that early in development, it was dark, and there were no one was holding back. And I'm sure a lot of it was tossed to the wayside, or maybe it was even just an idea. But I'm sure there's some version of the game, or even a script, that is so incredibly depressing that it would have performed probably worse than this current one does. Now, this darker version that would have Kenny be the villain, where Clementine was forced to make this choice and ultimately has to decide between herself and this child, is something I would love to see in a comic or even a book, just to explore that what-if scenario. Of course, I'm excluding the thing with Troy because that's just disgusting, and I don't want that. I don't want to read that. I don't want to see it, I don't want to read it. This sort of brings me full circle. The Walking Dead Season 2 is a very dark game. Even in its current state, it deals with a lot of morbid themes, especially when you consider that our main character is a 12-year-old girl. The game did not do well financially or critically. However, it's my favorite. It feels very grounded in the sense that in this world, things are bleak. It feels almost more in line with the TV show, at least the earlier seasons, with a lot of the environmental storytelling. All I can think of is something on the level of darkness would be the It Won't Stop Crying, that whole thing with the mom and the bathtub and you know what I'm talking about. All that to say, I have an appreciation for Season 2. I'm sure a lot of people do. However, I feel like a lot of this cut content was cut for a good reason. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Let me know if you want me to continue and go into The Walking Dead Season 3, or I guess The New Frontier as it's called, and see what cut content lies there. I'm sure it's very interesting. I haven't really heard anything about its cut content. I'm curious what I'll find. So thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate you all very much, and have a good evening or morning or yeah, whatever.